For sure, the highlight of my journalism career was during the period where Nelson Mandela had just died and before he was buried. Like that sort of, there's about a 10-day period. And I was covering that primarily for USA Today. And during that time, I had the ability to talk to basically every single person I met about what was going on, who Mandela had been for them, why and how he had resonated with them, how he had changed their life. And so these were people who were, some of them were ordinary people on the street, or like they were going to lay flowers at City Hall, which is where he had made his first public appearance when he was released from prison. He came out at Cape Town City Hall. And so I went there. There were lots of people laying flowers there.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Sound Bombing. I created this show for people who want to experience a radical, life-changing journey through the sounds of my diverse guests. I hope that each sound you hear on this show will strengthen your faith, encourage your dreams, and challenge you to awaken the greatness within you.
Drop the bomb. Drop the bomb. We're gonna drop the bomb. Drop the bomb. We're gonna drop the bomb. Drop the bomb. We come to drop the bomb. Drop the bomb. With the bomb.
This is a journey into sound. A journey which along the way will bring to you new color, new dimension, new values, and a new experience.
Ladies and gentlemen, the star of the show,
Lamar Darnell Shields.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever the time of the day it is, you're at the right time, at the right place with the right host. I'm your friend, Dr. Lamar Darnell Shields, and I'm so glad that you decided to hang out with me in the Sound Bombing Studios. You know, this show is about bringing on some of the most amazing people across the globe that are doing some amazing jobs across the country, across the globe, and today we're not going to let you down. Well, you all know, or if you don't know, I am a writer and I have several books out. What I Learned in the Midst of Chaos, The Making of an Ubuntu Teacher, Miguel's Amazing Adventure, 101 Things Every Boy of Color Should Know, 10 Steps Out of Puberty. I have been writing for a very long time. My mom said when I was younger, I used to write poetry. And of course, some of the girls I wrote poetry for, and then other people. And so, but I know it's hard to make time for writing when we are already so busy. We're so busy doing so many things. And it's even harder to find the motivation to even sit down and write every day. But it is not impossible. In today's episode, we will discuss tips and tricks for starting a daily writing habit. We'll also provide resources that can help you keep you motivated and on track, because we want to know your story, and we all have a story to tell. Well, my next guest has a story because she is a freelance journalist and writing coach based in Cape Town, South Africa. You know, that's one of my favorite places. She has covered social justice issues, the environment, the arts, travel, and other topics. And she, like me, has been on CNN, the New York Times, USA Today, Dwell, Ebony.com, the Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. We don't have time to name all the great things that she's been a part of, but I'm sure she's going to share it. As a coach, she helps writers improve their confidence, break into their dream publications, and cover stories that matter. Who am I talking about? I would like to welcome Rebecca L. Weber to Sound Bombing. Rebecca, welcome to the show, and I'd like to greet you in the words of South Africa. Sawubona, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much. What a wonderful welcome. And, you know, I'm used to hearing that phrase when I'm here in South Africa. I don't hear it that many times from Americans. So well done. Your accent is great.
Hey, I wrote a book called What I Learned in the Midst of Chaos, The Making of an Ubuntu Teacher. I love Nelson Mandela. I love Trevor Noah. I love Bishop Desmond Tutu. I also love Stephen Biko. I can go on and on and on about my love for South Africa. Now, if you notice, Rebecca does not have that South African accent. So I want to let our listeners know where you are originally from. How did you end up in South Africa? And then why did you decide to become a writing coach? So it's a whole bunch of questions, Rebecca.
Yeah, yeah. So I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and I still have my accent for the most part, right? My usage changes a little bit. And when I was finishing undergrad, I was taking my final exams, and at that time, the first elections were about to happen in South Africa. And I remember every day, I mean, in those days, you got a physical newspaper in the mornings, a paper newspaper, and just watching what was going on. I was just like, man, like everything is changing in South Africa. It was definitely seemed like the most interesting place to be. And I applied to a teaching program to be able to come to South Africa for 1 year. That was the original idea. But of course, that's like a really long time ago. I got sort of sucked in and hooked in, and still remains an incredibly, incredibly interesting place to be. And that's how I wound up here initially from by way of Boston. And in terms of the writing coach, look, there were some things that happened in between going to South Africa originally and where I am now. And originally I was a teacher. I worked in education for a while. Then I was in New York and DC and worked as a freelance writer. And then when I moved back to South Africa, I worked as a journalist for quite a while. And there came a point where I was like, actually, I have that background in education. Let me start working with other freelancers. Let me start working with other writers and help them along the way as well. So that's how I got here.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. I just interviewed one of your homeboys, Brian Sachetta, who wrote a book called Getting Out of Your Head. He was on his show airs today. And we were talking about the Boston accent. I said that Chicago and Boston folks we say something the same way, and it's spelled C-A-R, Ka. And I thought that we were the only people on the planet that said Ka until I was on the train going to speak in New York. And there was a group of young men who were sitting on the train, and they said the Ka. I'm like, where are you guys from? They said Boston. I was like, well, in Chicago, we say Ka. And so I'm sure you do have that Boston accent every now and then when it comes out.
Yeah, I can definitely turn it up a little bit when need be. I didn't know that about Chicago, though. That's interesting.
Yeah. So I'm excited that you're here because my partner, my business partner, shout out to Dr. Marina Gilmore. She's also a writing coach. She helped me write my book, What I Learned in the Midst of Chaos, The Making of an Ubuntu Teacher. And of course, working in South Africa, living in South Africa now, the concept of Ubuntu is a word that means I am because we are. And so every time I get an opportunity to talk to some people from South Africa or Africa, I really, really get excited. And I'm always encouraging people to write. My children are artists. So this is an art family. We're a family of artists. So you talked about moving to South Africa. You're also a journalist. Explain to my audience, first of all, how does it feel living in South Africa? A lot of people don't know the history. We're going to get into what it means to be a writing coach and what it means to be a journalist. And I know you work with other people, but talk to me about the state of what's happening in the country right now. We know COVID is hit, and there's so many different things that are taking place there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if I can just briefly talk a little bit about when I first came and that sense of Ubuntu when I arrived, because when I originally came, it was, I think January of 95, and everything was changing. I mean, everything was changing. Mandela was president. At that time, I felt like he'd been president for a really long time, but it was less than a year.
He was always our president. He was really the president, even though he was incarcerated,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the leadership, no question. And when I arrived, the sense of anything can happen, we can do anything collectively, because everything had just been shifted, and it was this collective, powerful energy all going towards this one clear goal that was so powerful. And I'm sure that that's a big reason of why I got so hooked in, was this is a place I want to be a part of and to stay longer. And so that, to a certain extent, that energy it's not the same today as it was then. Things have changed everywhere in these last few decades. And I think that part of that is because there was such a clear, we need to overthrow the government. There was a really strong, this is the united thing that we need to do. And now there are people doing all different types of things, trying to reverse systemic problems in all different spheres. COVID has hit really hard here. We had a super hard lockdown. They say it was second only to China. Initially, you couldn't go out really for things other than getting medical care and groceries and stuff. And it's hit really hard. We are already having economic problems, and we are seeing things getting better. And I think people being able to figure out what is this next way forward. I think that's the question that's going on everywhere. And I think that in a place like South Africa, where the long-term problems in terms of distribution of resources, we see now like the seeds that were being sowed so many decades before, right? So many things, positives have happened and new changes have happened. And I think there's still a clear sense that people support one another, help one another out. And yet it's a little bit less clear what exactly is supposed to happen next.
And so even though you're not from the country, originally you're from the US, do you feel a sense of connection to being in South Africa?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel a sense of connection to both. I tend to be wherever if I'm visiting the States, which I haven't been since before the pandemic started, I would refer to South Africa as home. And sometimes when I'm here, I refer to the States as home. I think they're both really a part of me at this point. I've loved ones in both places. I've worked in both places. I tried hard to understand what's going on in both places.
So what are some things that you're learning about the country? I know you've been there for quite some time. As a journalist, you probably look at the world through a different lens than someone who is just a traveler, someone who is considered a tourist, and you're no longer a tourist. What are some things that you're learning about the country that really surprised you prior to getting there? Because, of course, you have all these great films. I love the film Stephen Biko. There's a book called Kaffir Boy. There's tons of books and films about South Africa. What were some things that you learned, or what were some myths that needed to be debunked once you're like, oh, let me check that off the list. That wasn't true. Oh, let me check that off the list. That wasn't true either.
Well, of course, the myths for me are like my misconceptions. I always attribute to like my own lack of knowledge, my own ignorance of like, if I'd done a little bit more research, I might have figured that out. One thing that did surprise me when I first arrived is that where I am in Cape Town, Afrikaans is a dominant language group here. We've got 11 official languages, and they tend to be regional on the parts of the country. And at the time, I really saw Afrikaans as I thought of it as being the language of the oppressor. I thought it was a language that basically white people spoke. All of the stuff that I had read about uprisings and people protesting against using Afrikaans as a language being used in schools as a mandatory language. The reality was when I got here was that the majority of people who speak Afrikaans are actually people of color. And that's different regionally, but in my region, Afrikaans is a language that's very, very widely spoken. And the majority of people who speak it are people of color. So this was like a sort of an interesting cultural thing to sort of recognize that this one thing that was very true in another part of the country played out very differently here where I was. Obviously, if there's a language being spoken widely in the area that you live, you want to learn how to speak it. And I had come thinking, I won't learn Afrikaans. That is something that I won't do. That's like, that's a language of the oppressor. And actually is one of the first things that I wound up doing was, since I was teaching that first year and the kids I was teaching were speaking Afrikaans, was learning how to speak Afrikaans.
So my first connection to South Africa, I won't go as deep as Stephen Biko and Nelson Mandela, all those individuals. My introduction to South Africa was for two ways. One is I had a student from South Africa, but prior to that, one of the great Broadway musicals about South Africa was Serafina. I love the movie, the singing, the dancing. It really inspired me. I was already into social justice issues. And then, what's interesting, you are a teacher. Whoopi Goldberg was a teacher in that film. She was a teacher of history, but she had African or South African roots. But, being a teacher in any country where you're teaching young people to be independent, to become independent thinkers, critical thinkers, can be somewhat of a challenge. How are you as a white woman coming from the U.S.? How do you feel? Do you feel, because there's a difference between of belonging and feeling accepted. Like you can feel like that you belong, but then you don't feel like that you might be accepted. As a man of color, quite often I go into places where I feel like I belong because all of this is my stuff. I teach my kids. Everywhere I go is mine. But then there's a level of, I don't really feel like I fit in here. Do you ever feel that way? And if so, what was some of the things that you maybe had to do to sort of overcome those things when it comes to not feel like that you're really fitting in? But you definitely belong because you're a teacher.
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. Look, I think it's somewhat different when I first arrived than where I am now. And one of the things that I think really shifted for me, or that I started noticing after I'd been here for a few years, when people would ask me, when locals would ask me, how long have you been here? Because they usually assume when they hear me speak, oh, you're just here, you're going home again in 2 weeks. And when they would hear that I had been here for a few years, very often people would make comments that would indicate that they saw me as somebody who was staying. And in particular, I mean, I don't want to make it so like stark, but in particular, people of color would say, you're a South African now. Whereas white people would often be like, why are you here? Why are you staying? Like that. I mean, if I was going to make a really broad separation, like that's the sort of difference that I get. Obviously, the majority of people in South Africa are people of color, but that sense of acceptance I have largely found. And I think that that's partly, I think that there are some roots, particularly with older folks, about like sort of the role that people from the States had in the anti-apartheid movement. Like, I think there's some like allegiance that people see there, but also I think it is a sort of a welcoming kind of a spirit. And yes, like recognizing that there's some differences, my origins are different, but also seeing like you're here for a long time, that there is, I think, generally speaking, a lot of acceptance.
Well, speaking of acceptance, one way to get accepted is by writing, is letting people know what's on your mind. It's in your head. Before we get into your being a professional journalist and also a writing coach, in my introduction, I talked about starting a writing habit. With many people I come in contact with, Rebecca, when I'm traveling, lecturing, doing Zoom calls, I'm always quoting writers, poets, I love movies. I love words. I just love, two of my favorite words in lexicon is to imagine and create. I just love those words. But many people say they struggle with writing habits. How do you start a daily writing habit? Someone like you get paid as a journalist, you get paid as a freelancer, you get paid as a blogger. Well, sometimes you don't, but you also, it builds. How do you start getting into a writing habit? And what are some things that you did to create a writing habit?
Yeah. Well, look, I'll be very honest. I probably identify with your kids. Like in terms of like as a kid, I was into reading and writing and would do it for fun, right? Which is not the case with everyone who's a professional writer or who wants to get their message across. And for me now, and also with so many of the people that I've worked with, I also, this has also happened when I was working in a traditional classroom, is that we would do the thing that I call free write, but you may have heard it by like morning pages or thought download. Like there's different ways of talking about it. But the initial thing of just being like, I'm going to write for a short period of time. I recommend doing it like with a pen or pencil and allowing your hand.
Yeah. Why would you recommend? Because, this is a generation of this right here.
I know. It activates a different part of your brain, right? Like when they put those, I don't know what they are, electrodes on to see what happens if you're using a keyboard versus pen. It's different parts of your brain. And in my own experience, I find that the things that come out when I'm writing by hand tend to be a little bit more raw, tend to be more real. The best stuff that I ever write is always by hand. And I know that sounds like very personal, but I think it's something to play around with. Of course, if you want to do it, on your phone or on a keyboard, you can try that out. But I'd encourage you also people to try out, what's it like if I write for 10 minutes by hand and see what comes up. And the idea there is to just give yourself that 10 minutes or one page or longer when you feel ready of just not actually judging, not stopping to cross out, not pausing, of just getting to that experience of what is it like to just take what's in your head and get it onto the page or onto the screen. And that helps with that. I mean, you're prolific, right? You like rattled off all the names of all the books you've written. And so I think like being able to open that up, even if it's not for publication, a little bit every day can help a lot.
Listening to you talk about developing writing habits really sounds like meditation and mindfulness. And I know you talk about mindset. When you said getting it out, no judgment, just get it out and then sort of keep moving on. There's some people who are saying, well, I'm not a writer. My spelling is not great. I have so many thoughts in my head. My English teacher talked about subject verb agreement, didn't understand any of that. Don't understand pronouns, subject pronouns. Don't understand the parts of speech. When you talk about the parts of speech, people are like, what are you talking about? So then what advice do you have for those people who are sort of doubting themselves? They're already creating a story, and we're talking about writing stories eventually, but they're creating a story in their head that what they can't do. What advice do you have for those people? Because they're listening to you like, oh, you're a journalist, you travel to South Africa, you traveled all over the world. But I think quite often people don't realize that people like you who are writers, that there was, even though it might have come natural to you, and I'm just assuming this, that there was also some roadblocks. So I want to help those individuals who struggle with, pen and pad. I'm a buddy of mine right now. He was telling me about, he has this canvas. He says, man, I've been holding on to this canvas for 3 or 4 months now. I don't know what to do. And I'm like, dude, just get some paint and do whatever comes to mind. Walk us through those things.
Mm-hmm. Well, the great thing also about paint is that you can just like go again, right? Like if especially, and maybe not watercolor, but if it's like acrylic or something, you can just be like, let's just go again. And the same is true with words. Look, I totally still doubt myself. I always have. I probably always will. But I think that one of the differences between somebody who's able to keep writing and get published is that they're less likely to see doubt as an indicator of like, you're wrong for doing this. You shouldn't be trying, or that the doubt is an indicator that it's time to stop. You just say like, doubt is part of the creative process. Like it's going to show up and be like, it's okay. It's okay that there's some doubt. And also that it's okay that there's doubt if, like you say, like if it's an old English teacher that's rattling around saying like, you're not spelling it right, or like, easier said than done. But like, if we can identify that it is really somebody like that, like an English teacher, just be like, thanks so much for your opinion. Like, I don't need you anymore. Right. That English teacher was probably doing the best they could with what they understood, but that is not going to be helpful for anybody in terms of communicating what they really want to get across, get their story told, and put writing out into the world that is ready to be heard by other people.
So in the introduction, people, you heard that I said that Rebecca, not only is she a journalist, she is a writing coach. Can you explain to us what the ham sandwich, a writing coach, is? And if someone wants to hire a writing coach, what are some questions that they should be asking the coach as they interview them? Because they should interview, if it's a life coach, writing coach, mentoring coach, fitness coach. But explain to my listeners what a writing coach is, and then what are some of the questions that they should ask as they're looking to recruit one?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, to be honest, I think it means different things for different people, right? I think that in broad terms, a writing coach is somebody who's going to support and guide you on your journey. And it might be, for example, like what you just said, like, how do I handle and navigate this doubt that's coming up? So it might be like mindset issues. It might be, I want to get my articles published. I want to get my book published. What's that process look like? I need somebody to help guide me. And the analogy to the sports coach, I think, is really, really useful, because you can think about that they might teach you a play. Like, this is what we're going to do. We're going to repeat this again and again. But they also can come in and you can ask them questions when you're trusting them. So it can be like this sort of two-way relationship. But I think that what are the questions to ask them? You want to be thinking about who they've worked with before, what kind of writing they've done, if that's relevant and important to you. If you want somebody who's like showing you what they've already learned how to do, what kind of results or outcomes do the people who they've worked with, do they get? What can you expect from them? I would ask them, can you help me? Can you help me with, with these specific things that I'm looking to get help with? And I agree with you that being clear about what you want and then being able to ask for those things and have a conversation, that you are in that role of interviewing them to figure out if they're able to help you or not.
So what should one expect from a writing coach? Like, what are some of the expectations? And then how do you know if this is a good fit for you as a coach? So Rebecca, have you ever worked with someone and said, this is not working out? And if so, what were the reasons that it might not work out? Because quite often the coaching matching or the coaching student may not work out.
Yeah. It's totally different than when you are, say, in fourth grade and this is just your teacher for the year, right? Somebody else makes the match, and sometimes it's not a good match, right? So what I personally do is I do have like some questions that I ask ahead of time to help identify like basically those things of like, where are you now? Where do you want to be? What are your biggest challenges? What do you think has been holding you back? I do ask them also about their strengths. Like, what is it that we can use as a foundation, as a base, where you want to be in 6 months, those kind of things. And then usually from there, I can get a pretty good sense of either I've helped a lot of people with exactly these things, or maybe I haven't helped with these things, but I think I can, or this is just like totally outside of what I've done before. And from there, I might either say, let's get on a call and discuss, or we might do email. And sometimes I say, I don't think I can help you. I mean, if I don't think that I can, I don't think it's a good use of either of our time to get into that relationship. For the most part, that sort of that process of discussing ahead of time and communicating ahead of time. And of course, on both sides, we're writers, so we're able to think about it and write it out. And we have this back and forth discussion that usually works. on occasion, there have been bad fits that we only recognize later on. And when that happens, same thing. We sort of talk about it and say, like, this isn't working for these reasons. I mean, I can think of one person that comes to mind that had really wanted to do something that was really outside of my scope of experience. And at a certain point, she said that, like, this isn't working. And we did a refund. And it was sort of like, we were both sort of glad on that sense that, like, this isn't working. We both recognize this and this isn't a good fit. That's the exception. But I think with anybody, whatever you're investing in, like whether you're choosing a book, whether you're choosing a course, like an individual, think about, what is it that I want from this? What am I able to bring? What are my expectations? And then to be clear about it. And so you may want to be writing it out all along the way, even if the coach isn't asking you those questions, for you to be able to think about them ahead of time. I think it enables you to make a clear decision about whether it's a good fit or not.
How would you describe yourself as a coach? What is your style? Let's just say, if I became one of your students and or clients, what should I expect from Rebecca?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in this call, you're asking me questions. I'm talking a lot. I usually don't talk that much when I'm coaching. I ask some questions. I ask more questions. I try to help people tease out what they're thinking about how they write, try to help them touch base with what they already know, what they're already capable of, what the things are. There's usually, as we all already mentioned, doubt, but there's usually fear or overthinking or indecision or uncertainty. There's virtually always some of those things are coming up while they try to do specific external tasks. Either I want to, let's say, like, I want to pitch this article, or I want to write this article that I've been assigned. And we work in real time with, like, well, what's holding you back? So we can identify what's going on there, identify their mindset, so that we can adjust. How could we approach this differently so that you can do the work with more ease, so you can create more clarity for yourself, tap into your creativity, into your flow, into your confidence, and get the work done so you actually enjoy the work. Like I said, like, there'll probably always be some doubt. That's not super enjoyable, but we don't want it to be so oppressive that you don't get started, right? There are a lot of people that say they want to write that, that 10 minutes seems like too much. And being able to be clear about what your own expectations are for yourself, what your own goals and dreams are for yourself is really important. And making a roadmap to get there that feels doable, but also stretching yourself a bit.
Well, speaking of stretching yourself, I know that you're also a journalist, and I'm always interested in the mindset of a journalist. So you're going from being a coach then to a journalist. Walk me through what's going through your mind as you approach a story, whatever that story may be. Are there certain steps that you actually take, research, reaching out to people? Do you pray or meditate before you start writing? What is that process? I'm always interested in the creative process of an individual as they approach a piece of artwork.
Yeah. So one of the things that I really think about early on, ideally as early as possible, is who this is going to be for, who the audience is, who the readers are, and trying to think also, I don't think this is conventional necessarily. I don't think all journalists do this, but, like, what is the outcome that they're going to have, the reader is going to have? So it might be informational, it might be inspirational. Like, there's so many different things that you might be thinking about. What kind of outcome are they going to have? If they were going to leave a comment on your story or share it with their friends or just talk about it, what would they be saying? And sort of to have that end in mind. And then early on, being able to identify, like, what's the story about? Who are the best possible people I could speak with to interview? And from there, reaching out to those people. I like to do that very early on as well, because sometimes you need a little bit more time to set up interviews with people that are busy or hard to reach or whatever, and be able to sort of work with whatever their scheduling things are. Then from there, doing sort of research. I like to do all of the research and reporting usually before actually getting started. And there's this point where it's like, okay, I've talked to everybody I'm going to talk to for the most part. I know what's on the table here. Maybe I've gone out and done some reporting, like on the ground, like gone and done, like a tour of a place or met somebody at their home or office or whatever it is. And then once that's all done, I like to print everything out, get like a bunch of colored markers and a nice cup of tea, and just review everything. Like, here's what's most important. And usually from there, I can say, here's my general outline. And then it's time to actually start writing. And personally, I could say if I just even have a super simple outline, like here's 5 things I want to cover in roughly this order, I just start with whichever one is most interesting to me, whichever one has the best energetic, interesting thing to me at that moment. And so I'll often write out of order, but then in the end, it all sort of comes together. It flows together.
I
So
like that.
that's the overall process.
So what's a common myth about journalists or journalism? And then how do you sort of how have you debunked that myth that exists? Because as you're talking, I'm thinking I'm thinking the hat, I'm thinking the pencil in the ear, I'm thinking males, of course, I'm thinking old school stuff. What's one of those common myths out there that you constantly debunk as a journalist? Because when we watch these TV shows, they seem so glorious. Unless you're at White House correspondent, depending on who's in office, it's not that beautiful.
Yeah. I think it's look, I think it depends a lot on the kind of work that people do, but I think that it's actually that sort of image that you're painting is not so negative. I feel like a lot of the images of the media are really negative. Like here are these people that are out to just make propaganda or to put this like really negative spin on everything.
And why do you think that's so? Why do you think that's so? Why do you think the image of the media has changed?
I think it's partly because, my personal theory is I think it's partly because people are reading stuff that is not actually very balanced. There's freedom of the press. And so anybody pretty much can put things up. And so I think that, for example, I get a lot of weird WhatsApp stories, variations, like things that have some aspect of truth, but are really part of like a disinformation campaign. And people see that, think it's true, and refer to that as the media, which is really different from some of the traditional things that are, sort of fact checked and balanced.
Because everybody's a journalist now. When we were younger, we had ABC, NBC, CBS, maybe Fox. Now you have a million different outlets that actually exist. So everybody, one, has an opinion. Everybody now has a platform that they can put that opinion out there. And quite often, many people don't fact check. I tell my son, everything that you believe on the internet is not always true. And so there was a story that just recently came out about a young lady who she took her son, there was images of her home. The home was torn apart. They said this is what happens when you take your 13-year-old child's cell phone. Well, come to find out that wasn't the truth. It was the kid has mental health issues. That wasn't the truth. It was all these other different things. Then people just start saying, just take the story down. Just take the story down. So getting back to the myths, what are those myths about what you do and how do you sort of debunk those things?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I don't feel like I'm necessarily personally trying to debunk, everybody's.
Well, when people ask you, when people come up to you, it's like, for example, I've been in the entertainment industry. I've been around tons of people and I'm like, oh, no, that's not the way it goes. Nope, that's not what happens on a film set. Nope. That person's job is X, Y, and Z. So when I talk about that, I'm like giving some clarity of certain things. That's not, I'm not saying you're going around like, hey, you the press debunker. That's not your position. But there are some myths, right? There are some myths that exist.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I can think of is that sometimes the person who I really want to speak with is hesitant about talking to the media. Now, personally, I'm not doing heavy duty investigative or gotcha kind of journalism. It's pretty straightforward. And I'm really usually try to be as transparent as I can. Here's the story I'd like to interview you for. This is why I want to speak to you. Here's where it will appear, those kind of things. And if somebody even having that info is resistant, then I will ask, well, what's the problem? Like, what are you concerned about? And it is usually some concern about like, well, I don't know how you're going to use this. It's going to be out of context. They often know somebody that has had a bad experience with the press where they were burned. And in my experience, talking them through that, allowing them to voice their concerns, the fact that we are actually in that moment starting to build a stronger connection and a little bit of a relationship, in my experience, they usually then do say, okay, I will speak with you for this story because that trust has been built. It's just, as I say, it's a tiniest little thread, but that one person then will not have a bad experience with the media and may actually say, hey, this person actually wanted to hear what I had to say and, publish it in a story that I'm glad that I was a part of and was able to contribute to.
So I know you've interviewed tons of people. I've read your podcast. Your blog post and the podcast. What would you say is one of your greatest accomplishments? Someone that you've interviewed that just really just wowed you. And the second part is, who's someone out there that you wish that you could sit down and have an interview with, dead or alive? Okay. So one of your greatest accomplishments thus far. And then who would you love to sit on the couch next to, dead or alive?
Yeah. So for sure, the highlight of my journalism career was during the period where Nelson Mandela had just died and before he was buried. Like that sort of, there's about a 10-day period. And I was covering that primarily for USA Today. And during that time, I had the ability to talk to basically every single person I met about what was going on, who Mandela had been for them, why and how he had resonated with them, how he had changed their life. And so these were people who were, some of them were ordinary people on the street, or like they were going to lay flowers at City Hall, which is where he had made his first public appearance when he was released from prison. He came out at Cape Town City Hall. And so I went there. There were lots of people laying flowers there. But also it was talking to people who had known him and who had had relationships with him. There was sort of special services happening in Parliament and being able to go there and talk to people who had brought their children and grandchildren. And for me, that was a real important cathartic processing time. And I do look at it as a collective experience of speaking to all those people over those 10 days. Of course, like the follow up to that is if I could have ever interviewed anybody, it would have been Mandela. I mean, you know, I probably don't have to get into why he would be the one.
Listening to you, I'm thinking about my friend Walker Brandt. She's an actress. She was on Star Trek Next Generation, and she was filming in South Africa. And I want to say it was Martin Sheen. Martin Sheen is the dad, right? I always confuse Charlie Martin Sheen. I think Martin is the dad, the oldest one, okay? One of the Sheens, but I think it's the patriarch. And so they were filming in South Africa, and she said he just comes into, her room, wherever they were filming, says, "Do you want to go meet Mr. Mandela?" And she was like, what? She was like all of 30, in her 30s, I believe. And she said it was just an amazing time. Like she felt like, this rock star was right there and she had access to him. And she said it was an amazing, beautiful experience. And I interviewed her for the show, and that wasn't the interview, but I literally just took that piece and let it stand alone because she was having this cathartic moment about that time, and for you to be there and to witness that. And then you say, being a part of that is beautiful. But, if I had a choice to pick who I would want to sit down across from, would be him. Yeah, I read his book, A Long Walk Home, read quite a bit about him. He was on my list. There were two people who was on my list that I wanted to meet: Nelson Mandela and Muhammad Ali. And Muhammad Ali, who also spent time in South Africa, I met him from a distance because he lived in Chicago. I knew he has a set of twin daughters. So I knew them from afar, but I never got a chance to meet with him. And so, again, to hear those accomplishments, those are beautiful. But I know. So in addition to that, I know that there's someone listening, Rebecca, who wants to do what you're doing. And they're trying to figure out, like, I want to be a coach, a writing coach. I want to hire a coach. I also want to be a journalist. What advice would you give to someone who wants to either become a writing coach and or to be a journalist? Talk us through those steps to becoming either one of those, taking on one of those, two of those careers.
So look, for me, my journalism has all been in the context of being a freelancer, which is, I think, really different than being staff. And for me, the way that I started was I had a full-time day job. This is when I was living in DC, and I started pitching stories on the side. And that was how I sort of built my clarity about, like, okay, like I can understand what a particular publication wants and identify a story, develop it for them, send them an idea. Pitches can be really short. Editors do not want to receive your full completed story. They just want a paragraph or two that makes it really clear that you're going to be able to, again, deliver a story that meets the needs of their reader. So you're thinking about what the editor needs what the reader needs. And that would be my recommendation for somebody who's interested in getting started, because it also, I think, helps clarify, do I want to do this or not? You don't have to leave your existing job. You can write about, if you're in another field, you can sort of take what you have learned in your other field or other industry and use that as a starting place, or some other interest area, or whatever it is that you find yourself Googling all the time. Like, whatever the thing is that is of a lot of interest to you, just sort of say, start there as a topic and ask, what are the things that aren't being answered, things that aren't being discussed? And you probably already have good ideas about who the readers would be for that. So that's sort of my thoughts about journalism. And with getting started as a writing coach, I think it really becomes, what is it that you have to offer? How is it that you would like to help other writers? In particular, if you have an area of expertise, so it could be almost anything. I think there are writing coaches who specialize in helping people write books, or in helping people with their journalism skills, or like you said, just for personal expression. Like if I want to be doing this every day, I want to be able to get in touch with myself and my own emotions and stories. Maybe you want to start writing children's books, or you want to leave a legacy, kind of a document for, children later on. There's so many different things. And I would say that for most people, it probably does make sense to look for somebody who has had the kind of experience and success in the area that you want to replicate.
So with all the things that you do, of course, interviewing people, coaching folks, living in a country that's somewhat still unstable because of things that are taking place, how do you manage your stress and deadlines throughout the process? I'm always interested in self-care practices for individuals who are constantly giving and giving and giving.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I have to say it's a little bit different right now. I also have added onto all that right now that I've got a baby right now. And so it's sort of like the sleep issue is actually, I think between COVID and the baby, I actually am practicing more self-care than I had in the past, because I have to get my rest. I have to have it a priority. And that has actually helped me filter some of my other decisions about what to say no to, where my boundaries are, what time I stop work, what time I turn the devices off, those kind of things. And yeah, I think being able to make sure that you're going to be able to be healthy mentally as well as physically are part and parcel of this kind of work. Not everybody wants to go out and actually report on the ground. A lot of people like to do it at home, and that's sort of very appealing. And other people love the energy of going out and, either filming or interviewing people, where they are. And I think either way, you can think about what actually gives you nourishment, which keeps you going, which keeps you motivated and inspired.
All right. I know my listeners want to get in contact with you. They want to read your blogs, listen to the podcast. They may want to be a student of yours to use your coaching experiences. How can my listeners get in contact with you?
The best place is on my website, which is RebeccaLWeber.com. And there's links there to all the ways to get in touch with me, email, socials. And there's a link to my podcast, which is called The Writing Coach Podcast. You can also look for that. Wherever anybody's listening to this podcast, you can just sort of search for Writing Coach Podcast in your podcast app as well.
Well, Rebecca, you've given us so much to think about and process, from, writing habits in the morning, understanding what it means to be a journalist and also a coach, and now a mom, and also talking about self-care. I appreciate that, but you cannot leave before you leave. Our second part of the show is called the Super Bomb Questions, and they're different from the first part. This part is their rapid fire questions. So I'm going to ask you some questions. I need you to respond as quickly as possible. I always ask my guests to take a couple of deep breaths before we begin. So inhale, let it out. Here we go. What's your favorite word?
Supple.
What's your favorite quote?
I'm sure I will misquote, but there is a great quote from Mandela about I can't get actually the words.
Okay. What's your superpower?
Right. My superpower in journalism is being able to pitch, being able to adapt a story for whoever it is that wants it and needs it.
What's your spirit animal?
I think I would say a tiger.
What moves you to tears of joy?
My child.
What do you wish you had more time to do?
Taking the truly deep breaths and stepping away from everything in the outside world, having more time to go inward.
What is the book or books you've given most as a gift, and why?
The book that I've given most recently is called A Path with Heart. It's by Jack Kornfield. And it is actually talking about, practices to sort of still your mind and your heart and to recenter. And that has been more useful, I think, during COVID than ever before.
What advice are you glad you ignored?
I was a terrible speller too. And I'm glad that I didn't take my second grade teacher's advice to spend my time studying how to spell words, and I spent my time reading instead.
What advice would you give your younger self?
The doubt is okay. The doubt is always going to be there, and you can do this.
What's your favorite sound?
Sound of the ocean waves crashing.
Well, Rebecca Weber, I thank you for hanging out with me today, all the way from South Africa. It has been a pleasure and joy talking with you. And I know my listeners learn quite a bit. They're going to start their writing process. They're going to reach out to you and they're going to ask you more questions. So thanks for hanging out with me today.
Oh, thanks so much. It was such a pleasure talking about South Africa, talking about writing. Thanks so much for having me.
Cannot do this without my super duper producers and my team and Supremacy for our theme music. And all of you for listening. Listen, make sure you subscribe, leave a comment, and stop being stingy and share me with all of your friends. We're on every platform. If you want to know more about me, you can go to drlds.com. And as always, believe that something wonderful is about to happen and that some people miss the message because they're too busy looking for the mess, but not you. You've been listening to Sound Bombing. Take care. Peace.